Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the breaking news of a shooting of National Guardsmen from West Virginia in the nation's capital that just happened, with the apparent shooter wounded and in hospital, but no more details of the suspect and possible motives are yet available as we go to air. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Adele Stan, an independent journalist and longtime chronicler of the right wing of U.S. politics. A winner of the Hillman Prize in Opinion and Analysis Journalism, her work has appeared in Mother Jones, The Nation, The American Prospect, as well as on the op-ed pages of the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. We will discuss what we know so far about the shooting of two of the 2,000 troops Trump has sent to patrol the streets of the nation's capital, and what Trump and the shadow president, Stephen Miller, might do to take advantage of this tragedy by invoking the Insurrection Act, for example. Then we'll speak with Julia Loktev, a Russian-American film director, screenwriter, and video artist. She was born in St. Petersburg, Russia, and immigrated to the United States at the age of 9. Her award-winning films include The Loneliest Planet, Day, Night, and Moment of Impact, a recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and an Emerging Icons Award from the George Eastman Museum. Her new documentary is My Undesirable Friends, Part 1, Last Air in Moscow, which opens in Los Angeles on November the 28th at the Laemmle Royal and in San Francisco on December the 13th at the Roxy Theater. We'll explore the similarities to the brave young journalists in Russia trying to report the truth as Putin shuts down what is left of the independent media in Russia and criminalizes any mention of his war on Ukraine, to the creeping authoritarianism in America as Trump intensifies his war on the press and his oligarchs buy up the press to turn CBS News and possibly CNN into the Pravdas of the regime and the Republican Party, just like Fox News. And before we begin, for over a decade, we have warned that Trump is both a criminal and likely a traitor, not to mention he's mentally unstable, egomaniacal, woefully ignorant, wildly incompetent, insatiably greedy, and corrupt. Now it should be clear to all that his chaotic misrule must be ended as soon as possible, and until that happens, Background Briefing will continue to investigate and expose MAGA criminality and cruelty, but more importantly, explore strategies and popular movements to bring about regime change as quickly as possible to restore democracy and civility and stop the systematic destruction of the United States at home and its standing abroad. To help sustain us with public broadcasting and freedom of the press itself under assault as Trump's billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media, you can make a tax-deductible donation to our nonprofit foundation, the Public Truth Media Foundation, at publictruthmedia.org or at backgroundbriefing.org/donate. And thank you. And joining us now from Washington, D.C. is Adele Stan, an independent journalist and longtime chronicler of the right wing of U.S. politics, a winner of the Hillman Prize in Opinion and Analysis Journalism. Her work has appeared in Mother Jones, The Nation, The American Prospect, as well as on the op-ed pages of the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. Welcome to Background Briefing, Adele Stan.
Good to be with you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And you're a resident of Washington, D.C., and you've obviously seen a lot of the National Guardsmen deployed. A lot of coverage has suggested that they're sort of wasting their time and picking up trash and raking leaves. But just before we go to air in San Francisco today, we're learning that 2 National Guard members were shot near the White House. What do you know about what happened here, who the assailant was, etc.?
Well, we don't seem to know, and I haven't done any original reporting on this. It's just happened. But from what I'm gleaning from the Washington Post, which has a team of people working on it, is that we don't know yet who the suspect is. That information has not been made public, and he is wounded and in the hospital. The Post is, now, in terms of near the White House, let's qualify this. It is one of the metro stops one would get off of if you wanted to walk to the White House, but it is not anywhere in the close proximity to the White House. It happened at a metro stop, a subway stop, if you will, where we often see, like a pair of National Guard troops posted. And, just yesterday or the day before, I spoke to a couple of National Guard people who were posted at the Eastern Market metro stop, and it didn't have any kind of exchange of consequence, or I just wanted to know what state they were from. They were from Ohio, and they were so young. And I said, geez, you must miss your families. Are you stuck here for Thanksgiving? And they were like, yes, ma'am, you know? And then it was a man and a woman. And then the man steps in and he says, but they're providing for us, we will be provided for. And I thought that was very telling. And so it seems that someone ambushed the National Guard troops that were at the metro stop. Folks will know it as in DC as Farragut West. And initial reports said there was perhaps an exchange of fire. There seems to be some disagreement as to whether or not the National Guard troops actually got off a shot, but the guy's wounded, but of course it could have been self-inflicted. It's really hard to know what's going on. But I mean, Trump really has posted these people with sort of a target on their back for any deranged person with any kind of political ideas that cast these people as the ultimate villains in the story. So it could be political. It could just be the general mental health issue with the shooter. It could be, all we just don't know. We don't know what the
Mm.
story is, but I do really feel for these young people who are posted to just hang out in front of subway stops, to remind the residents of Washington, D.C., who have been long ignored, by the way, um, that their city is no longer theirs. And so that's
Right.
not a good idea.
Right. And this happened on the corner of 17th and I Street, Northwest, near the entrance of a hotel at the subway stop that you mentioned. So there are more than 2,000 National Guard troops across the streets and subways of Washington, D.C. So, and this deployment has been going on for some time, right? So I imagine
Yeah.
having spoken to them yesterday, it's a couple of soldiers, they not only are they facing Thanksgiving with their family, they've been here, doing what? Next to nothing for a month and a half. How long has it been?
It is at least a month and a half. Yeah. DC was sort of the beta test for the occupations that came later. And yeah, and I mean, they must be bored to you know, to death. It's just, I mean, when they get subway duty, they're just standing there. That's all they're like security guards.
Mm.
Um, and I read in the Post that a pair of guards posted at the Eastern Market Station where I had talked to these two young people from Ohio, that they had been threatened with death by somebody. Um, and it's not surprising, and it's not because there's some insane crime problem in Washington, D.C. It's because there is a mental health on the streets problem, A, and B, that these people are being made, walking symbols, of the president, which is not what they signed up for. And many of them, whatever one wants to think about folks who join the military, many of them, this is the only opportunity they've got to get an education,
Hmm.
Many of them, whether they're the people I talked to, they look like, they were white kids, probably 19 or so. They look like they were right off the farm. And then you got a fair number of black guys, and women. And so, and the military has long been a path to the middle class for people who are otherwise disadvantaged. It certainly is how my father got an education. So
Right.
I don't know what to say about all of it. I'm very incoherent, I know. I'm just I guess my incoherence is reflective of the fact that there are many dynamics in this mix,
Right.
and it's combustible.
And these victims, these two National Guardsmen that were shot and killed, come from West Virginia.
Right.
But I'm concerned, and I suspect you are too, of the backlash. And given the possibility that you've pointed out, Adele, that maybe the person who shot the two guardsmen and was in turn wounded may have been reacting against Trump. You know, he's pretty unpopular in Washington, D.C. That's pretty safe to say,
That's
isn't
an
it?
understatement. Yeah, right.
Right. So, what do you think is going to be the consequences here? Because there's a lot to talk about in terms of civil military relations, which Trump is really destroying because he's basically dividing the military and putting them in untenable positions and trying to use them as political tools.
Right.
And as we saw when he recently Hegseth corralled all of the top generals and admirals at Quantico, Trump talked about using the military to train on the streets of America for warfare. Well,
Absolutely.
well, that's come to pass, has it not?
Well, I've always believed, Ian, that Trump's aim with these occupations is to provoke a kind of a violent enough response that he can plausibly justify to people who are not in these cities the invocation of the Insurrection Act, which would be nationwide. And the Insurrection Act is martial law, and it also could involve, the suspension of elections and things like that. You got an unpopular midterm coming up, and then in the meantime, you have the insane response of Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, and Trump to a video that was made by six members of Congress, including Senator Mark Kelly, who's probably the marquee name among the six, who were members of the military or the intelligence community, just stating uh, from the military code of justice that soldiers can refuse unlawful orders and that they should refuse to execute unlawful orders. So, I mean, it, and Trump threatened to, it seemed to threaten those folks with being hanged. He called it treason and sedition, and reposted somebody who said they should be hanged. So I think it's just such a fraught situation. And you got Hegseth saying that he's going to reactivate the retired Mark Kelly. I believe his branch is the Navy. He was also a NASA astronaut. And so they can court martial him for stating what is in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And then something like this happens. And we are in such an unstable time. And incidents like this will be used, just as the Charlie Kirk assassination, was used as a cudgel against the liberals and progressives. So I think we're in for a very tough time, rhetorically, and perhaps, in terms of what happens on the ground here in Washington, D.C.
Well, the fact that they're on the ground is the problem, though, isn't it? I mean, this is a completely unnecessary deployment, and it was preceded by a completely unnecessary deployment here in Los Angeles,
Right.
where they actually sent the Marines in along with the National Guard.
Oh, that's right. I that
Yeah.
somehow that I forgot that. Yes.
Yeah, and then they eventually had to leave because their job is not to police or apprehend or even shoot their fellow citizens. That proved to be an embarrassment, but that didn't stop Trump. And he's also tried to do it in Chicago and etc.
Right.
So he's in this case, he sent National Guardsmen from West Virginia into Washington, D.C. You said you spoke yesterday to a couple of guardsmen from Ohio.
Ohio. There are also guardsmen from Mississippi here. He just, he just called up the governors of a bunch of red states, and said, send me your guys.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
But that is against the law. It's against the Posse
Posse
Comitatus Act.
comitatus. That's right. It's
I
totally
mean, and
against the law.
but he's getting away with it. What the hell is wrong with our legal system and our political system that this flagrant law breaking is tolerated or can't be stopped?
Well, we've got a corrupted Supreme Court. And I think we have a fatigued federal court, to tell you the truth, because they know whatever decisions they're going to make are going to be, if it's against Trump, it's going to be, shot down without explanation by the Supreme Court. And in terms of these emergency, Trump claims everything to be an emergency. The Supreme Court accepts that definition of these actions being taken under emergency, doesn't ask them to define what the emergency is, and subsequently just creates stays that have no opinions attached to them. So we really have a truly corrupted Supreme Court, but for three members. And so there's no true judicial check on him except in certain locations for a certain amount of time, right? You have these individual judges who say, no, you can't do that. And the Marines leave, LA. But overall, with like what can the president do? What are his legal uses domestically of the military? You're gonna, I mean, that's gonna go to the Supreme Court, and he's gonna be permitted to do it.
So he's down in Mar-a-Lago for Thanksgiving, and I imagine that Stephen Miller is the dark whisperer, is
Yeah, right.
already whispering in his ear. I mean, I'm sure you noticed when Stephen Miller and J.D. Vance showed up at Grand Central Station
Mm-hmm.
with a bunch of hamburgers for the troops that were
Right.
wondering why the hell they were there, what went on there, and the animus that he has to ordinary citizens of Washington, D.C. So there were a bunch of aging hippies and communists. That's Miller's refrain. He is so over the top. I'm terrified to think of the kind of conversation that Miller is now having with Trump.
I think you're right to be afraid. I mean, I think some of the worst impulses of Trump we see affirmed and executed on come from, Miller. Uh, and, who knows what is inside that guy's mind, how he can emulate the fascists so to a T, you know, um, and be comfortable with himself and think this is a good thing or the right thing. It's just beyond me. But truly, if you look at what the things Miller has advocated, along with other people like Emil Bovee, who was a Trump official, is now a federal judge, and Russell Vought, the guy who wrote the Project 2025. But the agenda truly is, when you look at how fascist the two fascist governments in Europe were built, in the 1920s and 30s, those movements and the governments that grew from them. I mean, that's the playbook they're using. That's the playbook they're using.
So this could be the Reichstag fire for the Trump administration. And is that what you're saying, Adele?
I'm saying there is always some kind of Reichstag fire in the offing. Whether this is the one, I don't know. I think probably not. Probably looking for something more like something bigger, a riot or something. But this builds towards that, and it increases in acceptance of authoritarian, policing of a city.
So short of this being a Reichstag fire, an excuse for Trump and Miller and Vance and company to essentially suspend our democracy, which Hitler did using the Reichstag fire as an excuse. And he did it very quickly and efficiently. there are some checks and balances left, or albeit a Supreme Court that's totally in Trump's pocket and a House of Representatives that is totally supine, although there are some fractures there. So short of a Reichstag fire, what about the possibility of him invoking the Insurrection Act?
I think he's looking for an excuse for that. Um, and, this is an idea that has been floating around the Trumpian right for quite some time. I mean, when I was with Right Wing Watch, I broke a story. I mean, other people watched it. It happened in public, but it wasn't being reported. Stuart Rhodes of Oath Keepers calling for Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act and seize the voting machines. I mean, they have been talking about the Insurrection Act for a very long time, and it definitely seems to be something that Trump is pondering by the way he has dispensed his brown shirts in the form of ice and then used the National Guard and all of that to try to effect.
So, Adele, we're just learning that it was the West Virginia governor who said that the two guardsmen were killed, but now he's retracted that, and it's not clear about their condition.
Well, whenever there is an event like this, the first information is often not accurate, right? Whoever conveyed that to him, didn't have it right. Because adrenaline is running, people don't have full information, and they're leaping to assumptions. So, but if you're a responsible public servant and leader, you don't run out with with that
Right,
information until you have it confirmed by several sources. I mean, this is
right,
what happened with Kash Patel and the Charlie Kirk shooting, right?
right.
And he ran to the cameras. So, I truly hope that they are both alive and will recover. Um, but my goodness, I mean, how irresponsible
Right.
is that to run to the cameras with information that you have not confirmed?
Well, Adele, I'm very grateful you were able to join us here at this last minute. Obviously, this is an ongoing, evolving story, and I thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Adele Stan, who's an independent journalist and longtime chronicler of the right wing of U.S. politics, a winner of the Hillman Prize in Opinion and Analysis Journalism. Her work has appeared in Mother Jones, The Nation, The American Prospect, as well as on the op-ed pages of the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. We're going to take a brief station break and back speaking with the director of a new feature documentary on brave young journalists in Russia trying to report the truth as Putin shuts down what is left of the independent media and criminalizes any mention of his war on Ukraine.
Rational defense, weapons and motives, bloody fingerprints. How did a difference become a disease? Here comes the argument. Here comes the argument.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, Julia Loktev, who is a Russian-American film director, screenwriter, and video artist. She was born in St. Petersburg, Russia, and immigrated to the United States at the age of 9. Her award-winning films include The Loneliest Planet, Day, Night, and Moment of Impact. A recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and an Emerging Icons Award from the George Eastman Museum. Her new documentary is My Undesirable Friends, Part 1, Last Air in Moscow, which opens in Los Angeles on November the 28th at the Laemmle Royal and in San Francisco on December the 13th at the Roxy Theater. Welcome to Background Briefing, Julia Loktev.
Hi, Ian. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And you arrived in Moscow in October of 2021. That's just a few months before Putin's invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th of 2022. What was the atmosphere in Moscow like when you got there?
So at that time, there had been a low-scale war that Russia had been waging in Ukraine for over 7 years, but it was a war that seemed to not be a problem with the world letting Russia have the World Cup, for example. Everyone had gotten used to it. So nobody at this point was expecting the kind of full-scale war that has been going on now for 4 years, which is just incredible. And what was happening was there was this incredible crackdown on journalists that had really started accelerating, where in late summer of 21, Russia started naming all these journalists and not only media, but let's say individual journalists as foreign agents. So, for example, you could be named Ian Masters, foreign agent, source of mass media, foreign agent. And that would mean you would have to put this on everything. So this program would have to start with this disclaimer in kind of legalese terms saying this is made and or distributed by a source of mass media foreign agent. And let's say you were interviewing me, you'd also have to say, oh, we're talking to Julia Loktev, who we must say is a foreign agent. And this would go on everything these journalists had to put out in public. So it wasn't only their news stories, it was their cat pictures on Instagram, a comment on a friend's wedding picture on Facebook would have to have this giant in all caps disclaimer saying, this information has been brought to you by a foreign agent.
Well, back on October the 7th of 2006, Anna Politkovskaya with Novaya Gazeta was murdered on Putin's birthday. So there had to be that hanging in the air, right? That Putin could disappear you.
Absolutely. And Anna Politkovskaya, who was murdered, and other journalists like Natalia Estimirova, who were murdered, really kind of were a warning call. And one of the characters in the film, Yelena Kostyuchenko, works at Novaya Gazeta. And there's one moment where she goes in to this office and they've just, in fact, the editor had just received the Nobel Peace Prize, Dmitry Muratov. And she goes in and points to a wall and she says, these are our colleagues who've been murdered. So that is always hanging in the air over people, you know, the possibility of what could happen to you. And I think one of the most important things in this, there was also, you know, aside from being murdered, there was one of our characters, her fiance, also a journalist, had been arrested on charges of so-called treason. He's now in prison for 22 years. And one of the things I always say with an authoritarian society, it's not really what necessarily happens, it's what you're constantly thinking could happen at any moment. And you're living with this thought of the possibility of what can happen. So, for example, you don't need to arrest all the journalists. You need to arrest one for everyone to be afraid. You don't need to, hopefully you don't need to kill all the journalists. But, you know, there is this possibility constantly of what might happen. And that's how, you know, in the relative scheme of things, you know, of course, being named a foreign agent seems much more innocuous than being murdered or being arrested for treason. But it became so widespread. It was a way of marking pretty much all independent media a suspect.
Well, at the time of the invasion, in fact, right at the time of the invasion, I interviewed on my program Pavel Felgenhauer, who was the military analyst at Novaya Gazeta, and he was amazingly prescient. And remember, at that time, even the Biden administration thought that Putin would take the country, take Ukraine. But Felgenhauer pointed out that he said, no, it's not going to happen. This war will go on for years, and the Ukrainians will fight back, and the Russians will be stopped. And I was, you know, nobody else in the media was talking about that. Everybody was assuming, as I say, including the Biden administration, that this would be a cakewalk for Putin. So you don't happen to know what happened to Pavel, because I haven't called him since then, because I figured calling him would put him in trouble.
I don't, I'm sorry.
Right. But that's the way it is, isn't it? Right.
Yes, I mean, in Novaya Gazeta, you know, now, I mean, there is Novaya Gazeta Europe, but in terms of, you know, in Russia, Novaya Gazeta, it does operate in some ways, but they can't speak openly about the war. They've Also, Russia shut down all independent media in the first week of the war. They basically started with warnings. They said, okay, you can't use the word war. You have to call it a special operation. Then they sent warning after warning. Then they just shut down all independent media.
Well, your film is so important at this moment because it feels in many ways nothing is quite as grim and cruel as what's happened under Putin's Russia with the return of Stalinism. But Putin operates through, he regulates the oligarchs, and he's weaponized through hybrid warfare money and power around the world via oligarchs. And he's had them take over the media, for example, and all the, oil companies, etc. To some extent, Trump is mirroring that here with, for example, Larry Ellison, the second richest guy in the world, has just taken over CBS and in the process of trying to get Warner Brothers, and that would include CNN. So we are not immune, even though our version of an oligarchical takeover and a wannabe dictator is nothing like the cruelty and oppression in Russia.
Well, I think I have to remind everyone that, in Russia, it didn't start with arrests. It didn't start with shutting down media. It didn't start with, it started with lawsuits, libel lawsuits. Sounds familiar much? It's, the first kind of levers of power always go through these. Well, we're working within the framework of the law. We're just, uh, you know, making sure you did your taxes right, making sure there's no libelous information here. And I think that's really where it starts. I mean, we see this constantly now with the Trump administration and these incredible lawsuits, these incredible agreements that people are entering into.
Well, it's extraordinary to learn, for example, that the mediator who is supposedly brokering this peace plan that Trump has offered the Ukrainians or tried to shove down their throat, we're learning now that Witkoff has actually been coaching his Russian counterparts how to have Putin, when he calls to Trump, to congratulate him on the Gaza peace and also urged the Russian interlocutor to have Putin call Trump before he speaks with Zelensky to advise him not to sell cruise missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine. So we have our negotiators literally as stenographers for the Kremlin.
Jeez, it's amazing, it is really incredible. And of course, shoving down the throats of Ukraine is the appropriate way of describing what's happening with this peace plan. It's astonishing. And of course, so much of that is, you would think it doesn't require coaching at this point, but it is amazing how flattery is the first step with Trump. You have to come and you have to flatter and compliment.
Right.
As you will be seen as unappreciative.
Well, let's talk about your film and the profiles and the characters in your film, one of whom, of course, is the co-director, your friend Anna Nemza, the host of TV Rain, which is at the heart of the story. And it's, of course, was the whole period that you cover is when they're basically being shut down slowly and inexorably, and they have to now flee and broadcast from abroad. So let's start with Anna. How did you first meet?
So I met Anna through a friend. I met her a few years before this. So when this stuff with foreign agents started to happen, I knew that Rain had been declared a foreign agent, and I called her and I said, something's happening. And she said, you're right, something's happening. I think that's what we did really well, is we realized that this is not a small thing. We had the kind of wherewithal and the prescience to think this is important. When journalists are forced to mark themselves as others, this is important. Now, Anna had that summer started she usually hosted this political talk show, with political analysts trying to figure out what's in Putin's mind, what's happening at the Kremlin. But she also started this incredible show in the summer of 21, which it's just astonishing to me that this can exist, that this world could exist in Russia when I was filming, because this world doesn't exist out in the open in Russia now. She started this show called Who's Got the Power? which was basically about activists and human rights leaders and people who were trying to create a different kind of Russia, who were trying to do politics, as she said, in a different way, but kind of grassroots politics, who were trying to create a life of dignity for different populations in Russia, whether it be the homeless, people with mental disabilities, people with HIV, different populations, for example, women who had suffered domestic abuse, where there's no law against domestic abuse in Russia, believe it or not. So she was looking at this picture holistically and saying, how we treat everyone, how we treat anyone is how we treat everyone. This is part of our society. And here are the people who are trying to create a better world here, even under authoritarianism. And I found this program fascinating. And to me, this is very much what the film is about. Like, what do you do when you live under a government that you oppose? What can you do? Do you give up and flee the country, as many people said they would, when Trump was elected? Is that the proper thing to do? Do you just say, okay, forget it, I'll leave you the country and take it? Or do you fight in whatever ways you can? And what can you do under an authoritarian society when that's those are the cards you've been dealt, but you try to do something to make this place better. And that's what I think all the characters are doing in some way. And of course, when they did flee, all of these people left the country only when it was really a choice. They all wanted to stay as long as possible and keep fighting inside, keep working from within. But then basically everybody faced a choice of, do you want to, do you go to jail tomorrow, where you will be of very little use to anyone? You won't be a reporter from jail. You will get nothing done. Or do you flee the country so that you can continue working as a journalist? And at that point, that's when they were forced to, and they had to flee.
And they love their country, but hate its leaders. And I think a lot of people in the United States feels that way too. But what I find extraordinary is the characters in your films. Your co-director, Nemza, and Ksenia, whose fiance is in jail. Now he's been imprisoned or sentenced for 22 years for treason. And then Alicia as well. They're in their 20s.
A lot of people. Anya isn't, but a lot of them are. A lot of them, Ksenia, was 23 when we started filming, Some of these characters, most of them are extremely, extremely young. As one of the characters, as Ira points out, she said, I was in first grade when Putin came to power. Like, as long as I've known there was such a thing as a president, that we had this thing, because, before you go to first grade, you don't really know what a president is. You don't think about this much when you're like 3. But she's like, as long as I've known that we've had a president, it's been Putin. Now, of course, he switched places with Medvedev a little bit, it's cosmetic, let's say. But it's really, he's been in power for most of these people's lives. And they can't imagine another Russia. And yet through all of that, they could imagine how Russia could be.
Well, that's the takeaway from the film is evil is not eternal and truth will surely win. And what's extraordinary about the young women in your film is this display of the resilience of youth, and they're brave and optimistic and a force of nature in this fighting against this cruel regime. It's just breathtaking.
And all of these, it's very much a character-based film. It's not a film where you have experts kind of explaining things to you. It's a film where you live through these historic events with these extraordinary young women who are very funny a lot of the time. They just have an incredible sense of gallows humor, and they're constantly cracking dark jokes about this. And because they're so young, they're also constantly referring to Harry Potter as their kind of model of the fight against good and evil. Again, this makes sense given that some of them are in their early 20s, but with this idea of like good prevailing in the end, I think Harry Potter is very much their model.
Let's now take a brief station break. We'll be back in a moment, continuing the conversation with Julia Loktev.
Колдуй, баба, колдуй, дед, в чистом небе грязный след. как-то завелась эта гниль и мразь. Никакого завтра больше нет.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And we're continuing the conversation with Julia Loktev, a Russian-American film director, screenwriter, and video artist. She was born in St. Petersburg, Russia, and emigrated to the United States at the age of 9. And her award-winning films include The Loneliest Planet, Day, Night, and Moment of Impact. She's a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, and her new documentary is My Undesirable Friends, Part 1, Last Air in Moscow, which explores the similarities to the brave young journalists in Russia trying to report the truth as Putin shuts down what's left of the independent media in Russia as he criminalizes any mention of his war on Ukraine. So do you feel in a way that you're trying to wake up America with this film? Because the parallels are inescapable. I mean, there's actually, I'm sure you saw the film, it won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Film, the Brazilian film, I'm Still Here,
Great
which
film.
great film, and it puts you in the situation of being an ordinary citizen in a country that's taken over by a fascist government. And your film has inescapable echoes of that as well. What are you trying to tell the American people?
You know, the crazy thing is, when I started making this film, it was a film about something very far away. You know, unpleasant things happening in unpleasant places far away, somewhere over there in Russia. And, you know, through no doing of my own, unfortunately, I mean, this is great as a director, terrible as a citizen. It's become incredibly relevant here in the States. So many details from the film just resonate more and more with Americans. And I've had a lot of people in the US kind of come to and say to me, listen, I find this helpful to watch this now because it is inspiring, like people continuing to fight when the fight seems lost. Um, I think we so badly need work that helps us process this current moment. And this film has ended up doing that, you know, again, not through a matter of intent on my part. It's just a matter of history happened.
Well, your feature films have an extraordinary quality of hovering menace, and this film, which is over 5 hours long, uses time in a way that's so interesting and so powerful because you feel the characters going through the experience of time itself, the uncertainty, the kind of omnipresence of a regime that's about to come down on you and put you away for 22 years. As Ksenia's fiance who's suffering a 22-year sentence in a gulag.
Yeah, absolutely. Yesterday, Tim Grierson in the LA Times described it as a disaster movie. And I think what it has kind of in common with those is, you know, the disaster is going to happen. I mean, we know what happens to these people. We know Russia will invade Ukraine. We know their media will be shut down. But they don't know this yet. And we're watching this and living through it with these characters as they continue to fight. And it has that feeling. And, you know, because I've made fiction, ultimately, I don't really approach this so differently. I'm interested. I watch movies because I'm lonely and I want to spend time with people that I get to know and feel the world through them and connect with characters. And I think this does that in the same way that a fiction film would do it. You really are living through it with these people. As you know, this impending disaster. I mean, one of the films, I cut this out of the film because there were so many different pop culture references, because these people do live in a world where they watch Netflix, they watch Emily in Paris, they talk about Harry Potter, they refer to Gossip Girl. But there were also, during the first week of the full-scale war, a lot of references to Don't Look Up, you know, where you know the comet is coming. It was a comet, I think, right? Wasn't it?
Right. Right.
It was, but you know, disaster is going to hit.
So how much of a minority are your characters? Because we hear, you know, that Putin has basically been sending these kids from the provinces, minority groups, to the meat grinder in Ukraine, where there have been 1 million casualties, and somehow or other the country still endures this. And Putin's, I don't know about polling there, but you get the sense that Putin's still very much in control. The media is completely controlled. And Narod, I don't know whether they support him in the way that we're told there's a lot of support for this war, but not in the main cities. And he's been careful not to have the draft in the cities. So, what kind of sense do you have of the silent opposition amongst the young? Because during the Vietnam War here in the United States, the war was eventually ended because a lot of young Americans simply knew how ridiculous and terrible that war was, and they didn't want any part of it.
I think you said a very crucial word, which is polling. It's impossible to do any kind of polling or to get a sense of what the population thinks in an authoritarian country. If you live in a society where you could be arrested for in a group chat saying anything bad about the war. In fact, people have been arrested for phone calls where they, with friends, where they said something bad about the war. And some pollster calls you and says, so what do you think of Putin? Or what do you think of, this war? Of course, they won't say war, they'll say special military operation. You really are not going to be very likely to tell the truth. So it's very hard to conduct any kind of to get a sense of any kind of like, what is the public opinion in Russia when people can be arrested for speaking their opinions openly. I mean, this is a country where recently, an 18-year-old street musician named Naoko with her group Stop Time was performing songs by a foreign agent on the streets of St. Petersburg. They were repeatedly arrested. They were arrested, released, arrested, and finally they got released, and she had to flee the country a couple of days ago just for singing songs by musicians that had spoken out against the war. So it's very hard to know what anybody thinks. I mean, I found it incredibly striking when I watched the videos of her singing those songs, that there were young people who clearly you could feel this. You could feel that they were opposed, and it's impossible to express this. And one of the things all these media do, because all of the journalists that in the film, there's a second part that I'm now editing, part 2. It's another epic where it follows them all in exile, and they all continue to work in exile. And one of the things they do is they create a kind of, well, they get the truth to Russians. They continue, Russians can access it with VPNs, through apps, through YouTube, but, the Russian government keeps playing whack-a-mole with this, slowing down YouTube, shutting off this or that. But they do get this information to Russians where they speak about the war crimes that Russia has committed in Ukraine. Russia doesn't even talk about the number of dead, how many hundreds of thousands of young men it's sent off to the slaughterhouse in Ukraine. How, they don't care about their own dead, much less what horrors they are committing in Ukraine. When I say they, I mean the government. And one of the things that all these media do is continue to try to make this information accessible to Russians in Russia, but also what they do is help these people not feel lonely, because as Hannah Arendt reminded us, totalitarianism feeds on loneliness. So if you can't speak to your neighbors, much less answer a pollster's question, if you can't, your child can't say, oh, I love peace, war is bad in school, because then you will lose your parental rights and your child will be taken away. But maybe you can go to YouTube or get a VPN and look at these media and see people that don't seem crazy. And they're saying, this war is horrific. Russia is committing war crimes. They're saying the truth. And I think that's incredibly meaningful for people to have that now.
Do you think Russians and in general still want to be part of Europe and don't want to be owned by the Chinese?
Again, I think it's very hard to do so. I certainly have no basis upon which to do proper sociological analysis of Russia because, we just don't have that information. You need to get a sense of what people want. You need people to be able to speak openly, and that's not something that can happen in Russia now.
Right, but our government is just as amoral because Trump and Witkoff and now Jared Kushner, who's also in on the act, we don't know what kind of business deals they're making. We know they made a bunch of business deals with the Saudis and that they've monetized both the presidency and U.S. foreign policy. So it's difficult to know what kind of a sellout is going on here. But what is so disgusting is that Trump and Witkoff and Jared Kushner, there's no morality here. There's no sense of justice. There's no sense that one country invaded another and is cruelly destroying and murdering its citizens. And this is completely unacceptable. They don't even go there. This is just a pure transactional operation, and largely, I mean, you have to figure, Yulia, that it's got to be worth billions to Putin to get out from under this war that he's got the country into. It's been a catastrophe. But I would assume that given that the Russian negotiator is also the head of the sovereign wealth fund, there's quite a possibility that the money is changing hands here. I know there's no overt evidence, but certainly the deals that Trump has made with the Saudis have enriched his family.
I think for so many years, Americans convince themselves that our foreign policy, with all the incredible, horrific things that we've done, Iraq, Vietnam, I mean, you can go back, still operated, there was at least the pretense that it was operating out of some kind of moral righteousness, often misguided, let's say, often very misguided, but some rightitude. But I think, now there is no pretense. There is no pretense that something is being taken as a moral position. It is, as you said, it is a transactional position. Largely, it seems like we're constantly in this, Trump likes it's almost, it goes back to the flattery. It goes back to like Trump wanting to see himself as a peacemaker. He wants like the prize, he wants the laurels, I think, but there isn't a pretense of a moral position, I think. And again, that moral position has often been extremely misguided and has led us into a lot of very dark places, but there was at least the pretense, I think.
Right. Well, it was freedom and democracy that we were freeing the Iraqi people, but there's no mention of defending freedom and democracy in Ukraine.
No.
So, but do you think that we know that Putin is playing Trump and constantly does so, and we don't know the nature of their relationship, which is somewhat questionable, to say the least. But my sense is that, this dreadful peace plan that was literally written in Cyrillic, it was the Russian plan that was first surfaced. That is the maximalist position. And if Putin can't get that, I don't think he's going to budge, because I think he sees that he can wait the West out and wear it out. I don't think he has any real intention. If he can't capture Ukraine via a disgusting peace plan, so-called peace plan, he'll continue the military effort ad infinitum. What's your sense of whether or not there is a long game here?
I don't think there's very much motivation for him to do otherwise at the moment. I mean, there are, Russia has found a way of living with sanctions. They've found ways around the sanctions. There's not much motivation for him to accept something other than what he wants.
And that implies then
that means if this plan isn't accepted, there's no sense that Trump will fight for anything better for Ukraine. Absolutely not. So they're like, oh, okay, we'll kill a few more hundreds of thousands of people, which is just the absolute lack of consideration for human life is astonishing,
Well, I assume that you, like me, are against wars and against killing, etc. But it does seem that the only thing that will stop Putin is if the Ukrainians start hurting him and hurting Russia. I mean, he'll go on forever until, and well, I'm not sure the Europeans can step up and fill the void here. Is that the situation that we are in? If we are for peace and against war, do we have to find ourselves in a position where we have to recognize that we have to arm Ukraine?
I think that, yes, that is, I mean, because you and I might recognize it, but it seems that, the desire for the US to do that has decreased. What will likely happen is I'm not sure. I'm not that, I'm not good at predicting the future, but yes, I mean, it's, Putin, I think, will keep fighting and will continue to, he's made it clear as he's continued to, with the missile barrages in Ukraine just now. I mean, every time there's any kind of negotiations, they increase the pain imposed upon the Ukrainian population. And I don't think he's ready to stop. He doesn't, he wants to achieve his goals one way or another. And unfortunately, that's a very, very tough situation for Ukraine now.
Well, I thank you for joining us, and I really appreciate your film. And as a journalist, it gives me a sense of that this is an honorable profession, and not too many of my colleagues have the bravery of the characters, the people in your film. Not that I want the conditions in Russia to be here in the United States, but I think this is a time for journalists and everybody to fight back against the specter of totalitarianism, which has captured Russia.
And not only Russia.
Exactly. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate it. And again, I've been speaking with Julia Loktev, who's a Russian-American film director, screenwriter, and video artist. She was born in St. Petersburg and immigrated to the United States at the age of 9. Her award-winning films include The Loneliest Planet, Day, Night, and Moment of Impact, a recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and an Emerging Icons Award from the George Eastman Museum. Her new documentary is My Undesirable Friends, Part 1. And I hope our listeners enjoy tomorrow's Thanksgiving. And again, Julia Loktev's new film, My Undesirable Friends, Part 1, Last Air in Moscow, will open in Los Angeles on November the 28th at the Laemmle Royal, and in San Francisco on December the 13th at the Roxy Theatre. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.